Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK, and before we start, I wanted to say a few words about an upcoming conference. Let's be honest for a second, what does your influencer strategy actually look like right now? If your answer involves a lot of maybes or we'll figure it out, you're definitely not alone. That's exactly why Influencer 360 exists. Brought to you by Campaign and PRWeek, Influencer 360 is a high-level gathering of decision makers from the biggest brands, agencies and platforms who are shaping the future of the influencer and creator marketing industry. Join us on 28th of April at the Hamyard Hotel as we unlock the insights around how influencer marketing and content creator tactics can help your business grow. Visit influencer360.prweek.com for more information and to book. Okay, today's episode is all about creative bravery. The idea was sparked by something said by Nicola Green, Virgin Media O2's Chief Communications and Corporate Affairs Officer at PRWeek's Year Ahead conference. Nicola said her brand's biggest fear is becoming undiscoverable, meaning she's keen to take, quote, considered risks, which come across as, quote again, brave but not stupid. Several recent campaigns have arguably crossed the line from brave into stupid. We'll discuss those later, I'm sure. Our two brave souls joining me today are Ahalya Moxon, Associate Creative Director at FleishmanHillard, and Shilpa Saul, Partner at the Unmistakables. Hello both. Are you feeling brave today?
Yeah, why not?
Good. Okay, so I'm going to crack on the first question. How do we find that balance, do you think, that Nicola alluded to? What does a campaign look like that's provocative enough to be remembered without drawing criticism?
I think she's right. I think today you do have to work quite hard to make sure that you are discoverable as a brand. I think being provocative for provocative sake is probably not the right way to go about it, although you do want to be thought-provoking, so I guess it kind of depends on your definition of that word. But I think what you do have to be is original, stand out, different from what's already out there. Otherwise, amongst this sea of, content and AI slop and people not having as much time to pay attention to your brands as they used to, you really aren't going to make a difference. I do think that other point she made, though, about not wanting to draw criticism. As a creative, it's probably important not to start from there either. Because I think all of the campaigns that we know and we love have probably drawn some form of criticism in one way or the other, even if they're just a little bit Marmite and people don't like them. I'm thinking of one that was out a couple of weeks ago, the Channel 4 Fountain of Filth example, which was just so provocative in absolutely the right way because it was grounded in really useful information that should be in the public domain, amazing insight, great creative. But a lot of people just found at first quite shocking and almost like disgusting and gross from the visual impact of it. So I think the right place to be is absolutely provocative, but where you're grounded in real insight or thought.
Great. No, those really good points. And I think I know the fountain campaign you're talking about, and it is kind of disgusting, but that's kind of the point, isn't it?
Exactly.
So I think on those terms, it succeeded in my view. What do you think, Shilpa? Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with your point around actually don't start from the point of, we're going to be criticised because haters going to hate. So as long as you can back up the decisions that you've made about your creative, that's the main thing. I think what we're seeing a lot of is actually people are making creative decisions not really based on anything or based on wanting to be controversial and manufactured outrage, which is obviously very different to being brave and provocative. And I think those lines have become really blurred. We are in an attention economy, so we do need to raise our heads above the parapet. But actually, when it comes to brands doing that and knowing what we know about brands and trust and authenticity, I think the bravest brands today are the ones who have really, really understood, as you say, the human insight and actually built the campaign off that, rather than just creating controversy for the sake of it, which just never ends well in the end. It might get you wall-to-wall editorial coverage, but is it actually going to do anything for the brand? Is it going to make your consumers reappraise your brand? Probably not. So I think bravery and stupidity are actually probably two sides of the same coin. And we should probably move away from both of those and just think about, okay, how do we be provocative and how do we actually get to the heart of consumer insight so that we're creating campaigns that really do resonate with them?
And I think you're right. The ones that are treading the line between being provocative and the stupidity point that you made rather than being insight driven, you might remember the creative, but you usually won't remember the brand that was associated with it because it's just that shock kind of thing and it's not achieve that salience or the effect in terms of business goals for your client that it wanted that you would have wanted it to achieve.
It strikes me as well, they need to kind of live up to it, don't they? I mean, I think there's a really good example of recent weeks of the woes experienced by Brewdog. You know, that was a brilliant example of a brand that made a lot of noise and did some really effective, punchy campaigns at the start. And, you know, obviously they were succeeding incredibly well in the early days and until fairly recently. But then the wheels started falling off when they weren't really living up to it. So it strikes me, if you're going to be provocative and out there from the start, you need to kind of keep that going, really, or you might run into difficulties.
You need to have the goods to back it up in terms of your product or your service or whatever you're offering as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, on this point, we've seen many brands try to be brave and end up just being loud. Do any examples spring to mind like that? And in 2026, what does true creative bravery look like compared to just being deliberately controversial and relying on shock value?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple that spring to mind for me. One of them was from a few years ago now, but I talk about it all the time, which is Iceland when they did hot tick buns. You may not remember this.
I don't remember this. Is this the supermarket or the country?
The supermarket.
Okay.
The supermarket were like, oh, well, you know, it's Easter and a hot cross bun is religious. So to be inclusive, we're going to change the cross to a tick. And of course, the reason they did that was to manufacture outrage because of it played directly into culture wars. And I just thought that was gross, actually. I was just like, what outcome were you hoping beyond getting a load of coverage? Obviously, that was the outcome. But I just feel like, not to diss our own industry, but PR people can just chase the coverage without actually thinking about anything else. And is this going to shift the needle? Is it going to drive consumers in store? Or actually, is it going to cause harm? Which I think that one did, because then you've got a load of people going, oh, it's because of you lot who've come into this country that we've had to change our hot cross buns to the tick buns. No one cares about the tick on the bun. Like, it's fine, it's a hot cross bun, we understand the religious significance of it, just leave it. Like, we nobody's asked for it to change. That was a couple of years ago. And then there was one a couple of weeks ago that I wrote about on LinkedIn, which was around Brooklyn Beckham, and obviously so many brands jumped on the back of that. And one in particular, On the Beach, created a campaign. It was a Brooklyn clause. So basically, if you've fallen out with your family, then you get your money back, you know, to go on your holiday. Although I'm pretty sure the small print, and probably shouldn't quote me on this actually, but I'm sure the small print said it has to be within 90 days. And I reckon probably if it's within that 90-day, if it has to be before 90 days, I just don't think that works. But anyway, that's beside the point. I just felt like for a brand that's presumably aimed at families, or, you know, mums and dads who are going to be booking their family holiday for them and their kids, monetizing this kind of family misery just for me felt really off. And yes, it did so well. It got coverage everywhere, didn't it? It's like got wall-to-wall coverage. But I just felt like it was just a load of noise. And actually, they've since come out and done a really great campaign called About Insect Week, which is based on human insight around parents kind of going, look, it's so expensive for us to take our kids on holiday during school time, but you teachers have up to 5 days inset. Can you just bunch them together so that we can take the kids on holiday and it might be a bit cheaper?
Makes so much sense.
And it's just like, oh, okay, as a mum with 3 children, this to me resonates with me and I will reappraise your brand. But the whole Brooklyn Beckham thing, I was like, nah, you're just chasing fame there for no reason. It doesn't resonate with the brand values, I thought.
Those are 2 really good examples of when they've tried to be provocative, like on purpose, and it's gone wrong. Yeah. Sometimes I think brands are trying to be brave and do the right thing, but do it in a loud way and it doesn't go so well. So I think one example that comes to mind is Burger King a few years ago. They had created a scholarship to get more female chefs like into the workplace. And they did a series of tweets, I think it was. And the first one that went out said, "Women belong in the kitchen." And then soon after, another one came along that then explained actually that, you know, they want to get more women in the kitchen in the right way. They want to be able to fuel this career path for women to become chefs, etc. But the problem was they had done that first tweet to be provocative. They had the stuff to back it up, but everyone forgot about what came later. They were so focused on the first one. And then they had to sort of reel back and apologize and say, actually, we have this great program going on. But the way in which they had told quite a good story, which was more loud, didn't do them any favors. It worked way better in print where the whole message was together. And I sort of felt sorry for them in that moment, because you could see how any one of us might issue something out like that, because you're thinking, well, I've got the goods to back it up. So I think sometimes even just the way you disseminate it is as important as the message itself.
It's a really good point. And another International Women's Day one, and going back to Brewdog actually, do you remember their pink IPA
Yes.
a few years ago?
Yeah.
That was meant to be ironic, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was there to make a point, but again, it's something just gets lost. And I think they even, in their tweet about it, I think they had to do like a hashtag sarcasm or something. And someone pointed out, if you have to say something sarcastic,
right,
you probably haven't made it land. So
and this is where testing, which I know we're going to talk about, comes in, and it's so important. One, how many women were around when they came up with that?
Exactly.
And two, then did they then field it out to even, a cohort of women in their own office to say, well, the point that you just made, if you have to call the joke out, it's going to fall flat probably.
It's a bit dad at a disco, isn't it? It's just a bit embarrassing.
I think that's kind of what Brewdog became.
Yeah.
Because I think when they first came out, it was sort of cutting edge and new and exciting. And then it quickly did become quite dad at disco. It's kind of like, we all just sort of a bit bored of it, really.
Yeah.
So it'd be good to talk about a few more recent campaigns, actually. So far this year, we've had controversial work like, do you remember Ant and Dec's washing line? Viral moments that have been praised, like the NHS's Harry Styles media post, and those that have genuinely divided opinions, like Heineken's take over the tube. And we've seen similar kind of transport takeover campaigns in the past. Do you think the industry discourse on LinkedIn makes it harder to launch a campaign now? Or is it a good thing that our work is being discussed and scrutinised, or are we just too inward in our industry to sort of see what the outside world is thinking, maybe?
I think it is good that our campaigns are being discussed and scrutinised and discussed on LinkedIn. And I think it's good that we have such an open forum where we can share opinions on work. But I think the one thing that it is important to bear in mind is we don't necessarily reflect within our industry the audiences that we're serving through our work. And it's important to remember that in the criticism that comes back, in the opinions that come back as well. And I think to your point about the Brewdog one, even if it was a woman who created that or it was women from the industry, they might not necessarily reflect the women or the people out there that Brewdog or whatever brand are aiming to cater to with their product, right? So I think it is important to distinguish the two in your reception of some of that feedback, I would say. I think there are some examples like the Sydney Sweeney, the Good Genes campaign, that got quite a lot of criticism, I think, from our industry and other places. And just to be clear, it's not a campaign that I personally liked. I found it to be, quite a turn off. But the brand said that it performed really well for them. They looked at kind of sales figures that had an uplift after stock price, I think, increased and all of this. So it's probably an example of where there is a difference between the consumer that they had in mind and ourselves within the industry who are commenting on LinkedIn and our opinions. And you do need to be able to, I think, separate the two.
Yeah, 100%. We talk about that example, the Sydney Sweeney one, quite a lot in the office.
Yeah.
I remain convinced that, yes, it was made because right-wing Americans need to buy jeans as well, right?
Yeah.
They do. They need jeans. So people were like, okay, we've got our insight into this audience. Let's create a campaign that's going to resonate with them. And there we go. There was Sydney Sweeney. I don't think there was any cleverness around, let's create something controversial or provocative. I think they were like, we know how these people think, and served up a campaign that resonated with their opinions.
I think it's a really interesting campaign that's obviously worked for them in the short term and the medium term in terms of their sales and so on. But if the kind of political climate switches, I think people are going to remember that.
Yeah.
I think they're going to be, you're the jeans brand that in that time when Trump was around, you were kind of, sort of giving a nod and wink to the sort of right-wing supremacists. Yeah, I remember you guys. So I wonder if in the longer term, it's going to be as beneficial. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll never go back to more of a centre ground kind of American public, but...
well, it won't be any time soon, will it?
It won't be any time soon.
Actually, I wonder if... I hear you. I take your point. I think it's a really good point, but I wonder if actually short and mid-term gain versus actually thinking about, when will it swing back to where it used to be pre-Trump? 15, 20 years? Be a whole new consumer set by then, won't it?
Yeah.
So I think, unfortunately, they actually made a campaign that was successful for the people that they wanted to sell to. And I do think you've made a really good point, John, around just the socio-political climate in general, and some of the campaigns that I may have been critiquing 4 or 5 years ago. Today I'm like, do you know what, that's actually going to land okay, because people's perceptions are changing around what is and isn't acceptable, unfortunately, but that is the reality.
Yeah, no, it's very true, isn't it? And it's nuanced by by the year, but it's also by the geography as well, isn't it? And I think it strikes me quite a lot of the problems at the moment is every campaign is kind of global if it's on social media. So something that might be deemed acceptable and normal in one territory is not in another. So you're gonna constantly have those kind of difficulties as well.
Absolutely. And then it just comes back to what you were saying earlier about making informed, intentional decisions. Because as long as you can back up the reasons for why you've made a campaign in a certain way, and you have checked the subtext, you have checked, is there the potential for this to be misinterpreted? You have checked, does my brand have a right to even talk about this or represent this or talk about these people? As long as you've been through all those checks and balances, I would say from a PR perspective, you're fine. Because yes, it may well be controversial in, for example, I don't know, India. It may land differently in India to it landing in Finland. But actually there's a reason for that. And as long as you've got the reasons, and I think that's the most important thing. Quite often we see throughout the process, it starts with a great strategic insight, but by the time it gets to creative, it's got diluted so much, and someone somewhere just wants to win awards and then create award-winning work that actually has got nothing to do with the insight and it's got nothing to do with the target audience. It's just there because they can crow about it and write their award entries.
Yeah, indeed. So moving on, Ahalya, how do you find being a creative director at a large agency at the moment? And what does being brave mean in that context, within the guardrails that exist? Presumably it's quite different to when a challenger brand enlists a small independent PR agency to help it be disruptive, or is this a bit of a stereotype and maybe unfair?
I think there's truth to it for sure. So I can only speak to my experience working in kind of large agencies for the last few years. I started off in boutiques, but I do find a difference. I think it's less about the size of the agency, although we tend to associate them with larger or smaller agencies. And it's more about the sectors and the clients that you're dealing with. So if you're thinking about some of these bigger agencies, the bigger names, you're often dealing with corporate clients or clients in highly regulated industries like pharmaceuticals or healthcare or insurance or financial services. And absolutely there are guardrails there when it comes to creativity. And I think I would say, hopefully pretty objectively, that it can be harder to get quote unquote what we see as typically brave creative work through. And there's a number of reasons for that, right? So with these clients, often they're dealing with complex and myriad stakeholders within their own organizations. So getting work through, there are so many more layers, right? And it's so important to know what you're dealing with. I think regulation-wise, there are certain lines you can't cross. For example, in pharma, you can't be seen to influence buying decisions by a government or a large body. And so much work just gets sort of cut off because it crosses a certain line or regulation. But I think what's interesting about working in these environments are there's so many ways to deal with this. There's so many loopholes. You can sort of turn it into an opportunity if you like. So we just did a campaign for a huge pharmaceutical brand, their first external comms campaign, and they're generally quite risk averse. So it's quite a big thing for them to do. It's performed really well. Tiny campaign, but I think starting small is really key with these clients, because then you prove something works and they might go bigger and braver next time. Like I said before, I think learning who their internal stakeholders are and who the creative blockers, for lack of a better way of putting it, are is really important, because then trying to be able to pitch to them directly or helping your clients pitch to their clients internally to get the creative work through is something that you need to be able to navigate. And then I think also when you're dealing with these large organizations, corporate clients especially, or those in these regulated industries, ease of delivery becomes a massive thing. So you'll often pitch ideas to them that are really brave and really interesting, and they love them in the room. But the minute they go into the logistics of how am I going to deliver this in a stretched, sort of tight resource team, the idea dies. And so it's really important to be able to marry, I think, for these corporate clients, bravery with ease of delivery. And I think that's where usually you can have a win, I would say. But I think what's great about these kind of clients is if you're a challenger brand, a beer brand, for example, and you're in a smaller independent agency and you're looking for work that's creatively original and you're looking out in the industry, there's so much more to compete with because so much more brave work has already been done. Whereas if you're dealing with a corporate client or an insurance brand, for example, there's less of that work out there. So when you do manage to get it through, you're probably going to stand out more and you have a chance to make a difference, change their business goals, win awards, all of that good stuff.
It's really interesting, actually. One trend we've seen in the last couple of years has been quite a big investment by traditionally corporate agencies and divisions into creativity and equipment and skills around producing content and things like that. So it does seem like, I know what you mean, that could be somewhere where, I don't want to say easier to shine, but maybe it's less expected, so it can actually have more impact.
Exactly. And I think flipping that as well, that might be a reason why we're seeing some of the smaller independent agencies increase their corporate divisions of their work or approach more of those clients, because again, the reward is there to be had from uncharted territory and making a big difference to sectors that you might not have touched yet.
Yeah, love that point. Love that. It reminds me of the Cannes Lion. I think it won the Glass Lion last year. You know, the AXA campaign.
Yes, yeah.
Beautiful
Love it.
campaign. Well, I mean, I say beautiful, but it's obviously
Hard-hitting.
Hard-hitting, that's the word, around domestic violence. Did you see that campaign?
Yes.
Yeah. And I suppose that's a great example, actually, of what you're talking about around actually in an industry that's fairly safe. You have got the opportunity to create something really provocative and meaningful.
I mean, when you hear the word insurance, you think boring, unfortunately. And they had this campaign, they put 3 words into their emergency relocation clause. So instead of just being fire and flood, it was and domestic violence, which meant that they could then relocate hundreds of women across France to new homes if they were experiencing domestic violence. Such a simple thing, so clever, and, you know, not an idea that you might typically associate with that industry. So
Great. Well, moving on, and something we kind of alluded to earlier on, but how do you pressure test an idea for unintended subtext without killing the creative spark? Something I'm quite interested in. And how useful do you think AI is in predicting sentiment? I mean, we hear quite a lot of people talking about their sort of AI systems that can, to some extent, guess what kind of reaction they're going to get from certain messaging and so on. And yeah, sort of particularly if there's a joke involved or something that's maybe a little bit left field. So how can we do that, do you think, as an industry?
I would say that not many people do it in the industry, for a start. And secondly, it's about reviewing the entire creative process and the whole system of how clients are briefing agencies in the first place and what the key things are that need to be in that brief, right the way through to what actually does success look like. And the most important thing, and you alluded to it earlier, is having the right voices around the room. There's no shortcut for that. And we always see it, don't we? We see it in campaigns where they haven't had the right voices around the room. They just don't work, and they risk upsetting people, and they risk then share prices going down and all the rest of it. And the irony being that actually when you have got the right people around the table, the work is so much better, and there's so many statistics, like from the Unstereotype Alliance, for example, to show that the work is much better. So I think it's really important for people to just ask the question, what else could be going on here? What do we not know? And then go to experts to find that information. If you don't have the team in your agency, which 9 times out of 10 you're not going to, who else can you go to validate what you're doing, or to pull it apart, to criticize it? So I think that's really important. And then also I think, and this is going to make me sound like an old person, but I sort of am an old person now, I think, so that's okay. I think we're losing the art of critical thinking. It's just it's dying. And with the advent of AI being used more and more agency side, and everything else that's going on, social media, all of it, we just don't have, and I don't think people are taught in schools, that level of critical thinking anymore that I was back in the 80s, for example. So I think that that's really important to hone that skill in agencies and in in-house teams. And your question around AI and how good is it at predicting sentiment and how campaigns will land in subtext is, it's only ever good, and we know this, I'm just telling us what we already know, which is it's only ever going to be as good as the prompts that you're putting in, right? So you need to know what questions to ask, and I think fundamentally that's the problem. People don't know what questions they should be asking. I think as well, I've got a bit of nervousness around ChatGPT specifically because of all of the stories that have come out around who they're funding, and therefore are they actually going to be pushing an agenda that we're not quite sure about yet, but we may see it in a few years' time. So I think AI is obviously changing the way in which we work in many ways, in a good way, because actually when you come into the industry, and in my day anyway, it was photocopying press releases and stuffing envelopes. I know nobody does that anymore, but I'm photocopying and doing coverage books. Great, because you're getting really smart people in from university who don't need to do any of that. You know, there's no grunt work anymore. They can go in and they can use their skills really, really well because of AI being able to shorten the processes of things. But we just need to be really careful of putting too much trust, I think, into anything without adding that lens of critical thinking first.
Yeah, and I really agree with Shilpa. I think there's no substitute for speaking to real people. I think, unfortunately, it's expensive, as it should be, if you're speaking to real people and you're getting like qualitative research, for example. But when you're dealing with certain audiences, I would say especially marginalized audiences in any way, whether that's socioeconomic or minority audiences or whoever it may be, it's really important to go out and speak to those people, especially if you don't have them in your teams or in your workplace, which is often the case when you look at what, the type of people that make up our industry as a whole. And then on the AI point, I think, what we do a lot of is we work with synthetic audiences. And they're great because it's hard to speak to real people all the time consistently through your campaign as you're iterating. So you can create an AI-based audience that you can test ideas against and continue to kind of evolve your work that way. But they're no substitute for real audiences and real people because there's inherent bias built in. You need to know how to prompt to avoid confirmation bias and things like that. So it's a combination of the two, I think. Speaking to real people and then, using AI to constantly test and iterate, but not relying on it as a silver bullet, which can help you avoid that kind of subtext. And I think, John, you asked a question earlier, which was about what does true creative bravery look like, which I don't know that we answered. And I think it's this. I think it's being willing as a brand or as a creative or as a team to do the work that's required to speak to these audiences that aren't necessarily being spoken to. And I think that is where you see some standout work. So, for example, I think it was a few weeks ago we saw IKEA's Iftar at Ours campaign. Did you see that? And so for anyone who isn't familiar with that campaign, it was based off this like amazingly obvious but such a true insight that, many, many Muslims are on their commute or on their journey home when it's time to break their fast, and they're not actually able to be at home to do that in a family environment. And so they created these makeshift kind of homes in London and Manchester that look like almost like a typical British home, I guess, decorated inside with IKEA furniture, obviously, to look like your auntie's sitting room kind of a thing. And commuters could stop off, break their fast. There was amazing food there and all of this. And they would have never got there unless they were doing this work of actually speaking to those audiences and finding this insight that, those who are in the community sort of just knew and took for granted.
Yeah.
And so maybe they did some AI testing along the way.
Funnily enough, I'm so pleased that you brought up the example because, nice segue, that is the kind of work that we do. So Mother is one of our longest standing clients. We love working with the team at Mother, and they came to us last year with a range of different ideas around Ramadan, and that was one of them. And so we assembled a group of people. We call them cultural confidence sessions, basically, and we don't bring in people off the street because they can do that themselves. We don't do focus groups, but it's a kind of a focus group in that it's around bringing together people who have lived expertise. So that's a mix of professional expertise, as in they do understand PR, comms, advertising, marketing, so they're not just going to suggest something that can't be done, but also lived experience. So in that particular instance, everybody who we had around the Zoom was a practicing Muslim. And therefore, that's the idea that they went with. There were ideas that were killed straight off the bat because even though it's been created by people who do have cultural awareness, I mean, the team at Mother are fantastic and they ask all the right questions. But even then, it's no substitute, as you say, for going out and speaking to more people and canvassing more opinions to really get to the heart of what is going to work and what will land and what won't. And that's where the subtext and the nuance comes in.
Such an amazing campaign. I didn't know you worked on it, but I absolutely loved it. So yeah, amazing work.
Really good. It strikes me that if you think of any kind of purpose campaign, and we could probably debate for a long time exactly what a purpose campaign is these, but assuming we all kind of have a vague idea, it strikes me there hasn't really been a successful one that doesn't have a tie-in, whether it's with a charity or with a sort of a networking group, a campaigning group, or, as you say, a sort of panel discussion or whatever it might be. I can't really think of any. I mean, back in the day, I think the sort of heyday of purpose campaigns, maybe slightly before COVID and the early days of COVID, they would always be insert huge brand here and insert charity here, whether it's a mental health charity or whatever it might be. And that seemed to be the kind of playbook where I think a lot of the best ones came from. I'm not saying all of them were successful, and in hindsight, some of them were probably a bit off course still, but it strikes me it's kind of necessary really to do something like that, unless it happens to be something created by and for the people who made it, which is probably fairly unlikely.
Yeah, 100%. I think we could debate for a long time what even is a purpose campaign, but I think at the heart of it is actually what is relevant to audiences regardless. And it comes back to, and I know I keep banging on about it, which is weird because I'm not a strategist, I'm not an insight person, but it comes back to, do you have the right insights about the people that you want to speak to? And then it's less around, are you creating noise or not? Because your marker of a successful campaign is how well it has resonated with the audience or audiences. And like, I really loved the Golan campaign, Valentine's Day, where did you see? And they did a slow-mo of the hearing aid.
Yeah.
But they made it look like something else more to do with Valentine's Day. But I just really love that. It's not necessarily a purpose campaign, but, you know, at the end of the day, you're talking to people who have a hearing disability. And actually, wasn't that great? Because it was brave and provocative, but it was based on an insight.
Good stuff. Have you ever had a creative idea that you've loved but ultimately couldn't use? And how do you know when to pivot, really?
I mean, loads, absolutely loads.
Go on. What's been the one that you really wish you could have got out there?
I can't tell you because I'm hoping to reskin it and sell it to another client at some point in the future.
Right.
No, but there are loads. I think any like creative that you speak to will say, there are, sometimes at their graveyard or their parking lot or whatever you call it, might be even better than the work that they've got out there. And you have a sort of fondness for those ideas that are just sitting there, and you put them on a pedestal because they usually only ever made it to stage 1 or stage 2, and you didn't necessarily do all of the rigorous testing. So they're almost held up as this like thing. What was the rest of the question, John?
How do you know when to change it, I suppose, when to change it up?
I think to your point, Shilpa, earlier, I think common sense and good judgment cannot be underestimated. It's really, really important. I think as a creative or anyone in comms, hopefully, when someone is, laying out a piece of criticism that is just because they're feeling a bit risk averse or, not as brave versus something that you just didn't think of that's definitely going to kill an idea. I can give you an example of one that I would never have died on a hill for anyway. There was an idea for a healthcare campaign that dealt with older people who were getting killed by stroke, essentially. And it was called, hopefully I can do this one justice, but it was called Grandangered, and it was all about grandparents portraying them as an endangered species. That's a very broad description of it. And then I pitched this idea just internally to our account team, and someone pointed out to me that actually we're dealing with an aging population, so you have technically more grandparents or more older people than you did ever before. So then to call them endangered is sort of, and I was like, oh, okay, that's just something I didn't quite think of. So I think, it's a good example of where maybe you think an idea is better than it is, and there are obvious sort of issues with it. But I think also sometimes it totally just depends on the client. I think clients have lines, don't they? Mm-hmm. And it depends on your relationship with them. And sometimes, no matter how good you think an idea is, it's just not going to work for them for whatever reason. And you have to be able to call it and say, okay, cool, I'll park this one. And maybe down the line, I'll sell it to someone else.
Good shout. And Shilpa?
I can't think of any. I was just thinking then while you were speaking, when I was client side at Royal Caribbean, I was pitched an idea that I thought that was basically, it won the pitch basically. So we were doing a pitch anyway of agencies, and this particular agency pitched this idea around Noah's Ark, and it was going to be a spoof story, but it was going to be so layered in terms of brand is launching this brand new ship, and it's going to be like Noah's Ark and all of this great stuff. It was just so multi-layered, and it was a beautiful, beautiful idea, and I loved it so much, and that's the reason the agency won the pitch. And then I happened to have a very good working relationship with the overall global president of Royal. So when he was in the office, I just sort of went along and sat with my laptop next to him and said, I just thought I'd go straight to him. I thought it'd be easier than going through the many layers I had to go through at Royal. And I said to him, I really think we should do this. I think we're going to get wall-to-wall coverage. It's going to be really game-changing. It's going to make people really reappraise cruise. And yeah, he looked at me, and again, it's just getting a different opinion, isn't it? A different perspective. And he was just like, there are probably quite a lot of credentials that we would need to have as a brand for us to really be able to commit to that idea. And we just don't have them in terms of environment and so on and so forth, which I'm not going to go into. But it was just, I think that's probably my biggest regret, is never being able to get that idea off the ground, because it was just such a great idea.
I mean, anything to do with religion is probably you might have to think twice as well. That being a religious parody. I mean, do you remember Sausage Roll Jesus? That Greg's...
Yes.
Yeah. This was a Greg's advent calendar that depicted Jesus as a sausage roll. It was quite a few years ago. That was very, very controversial at the time. I'm not saying this is on the same level as that, but nevertheless, you've got to think if you're doing anything involving religion, probably
very true.
Be very, very careful. But I mean, and it kind of goes into this next question. I mean, are there any, would you say, sectors or instances where it's better to play it entirely safe with creative campaign ideas? Or do you think actually that's a cop-out and we should do what we think is right and then seek forgiveness, not permission, a bit more?
I think no. In a word, no. I think safe is boring. I think if something is safe, that means it's been done before, it feels familiar, it's foolproof, all of that stuff means you're not going to stand out and be original. And back to your first question with the Nicola Green's point, I think it's reframing what is safe and what is brave according to the sector, the client, the company you work for, whoever. And absolutely, you should always be pushing to the very edge of what's safe, but also makes sense and is grounded in insight. And just be prepared that might look different for a beer brand or an insurance brand. I think the AXA example that Shilpa spoke about earlier is just a perfect one for this. Not what you would expect from the industry, made absolutely huge change. Probably other insurance brands are sitting up and, putting that up on decks in meetings and saying, what can we do now that's similar? So it'll affect some change in the industry. So yeah, no safety.
Great. Have you noticed generational differences in clients' attitudes towards brave creativity, would you say? Or is that in itself a bit of an unfair stereotype that it can be cut up in that way?
Yeah, I think it is probably quite an unfair stereotype, but also I think it's less to do with the generation and more to do with the environment that they're in. So if they are in a highly regulated environment, there's only so much they can do regardless of their generation. If they're at Brewdog, completely different potentially. So that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think definitely less to do with age. In fact, I wonder if you look at some of the campaigns that we saw from, the noughties and that sort of era, I think CMOs, I'm making assumptions here, were probably a bit braver because we were in less of a polarized environment politically. It feels like people thought about stuff a little bit less. Testing ideas wasn't as big a part of the process. There was less danger in putting out brave work because it felt like there was probably less of a chance of taking off on social media in the wrong way or your share price suddenly plummeting and all of these things that brands need to think about today. So I would argue maybe generationally, quote unquote, old school CMOs had more bravery than we do today. I do think with PRs and the younger-ish generation, probably the opposite is true. We might actually be less brave today because we are worried about all of these kind of polarized factions when it comes to socio-political groups saying the wrong thing, holding on to clients in a super competitive environment within our own industry, the PR industry, but also, when ad agencies are coming in and opening up PR divisions and all of this. And that kind of environment, I think, doesn't really lend itself to risk-taking. It can lend itself to a bit more protectionism and being a bit less brave, really. So we do have to, I think, as an industry, fight against that and push against that a bit.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the point that you've made around CMOs perhaps being braver in the past is a really interesting one. I've never really thought about that. But thinking about what PR was like in the late 90s and early 2000s, before we had social media, there were only really a certain amount of outlets that you would be able to get your story across to. And because there was a limited amount, you knew those publications really, really well. So you knew what would resonate and what wouldn't. And actually what then the end consumer thought was sort of, you wouldn't ever really know. But now with all of the layers of different ways in which we can communicate with consumers, it requires so much more sophisticated thought process. And so I think as an industry as a whole, and everyone, when I was in Cannes last year, everyone was talking about the power of earned attention like it was some new thing, and I was like, good, finally people have cottoned on to the fact that actually earned media is so important, but it requires a real depth of understanding of that nuance and subtext for things to really land. Like, you can't ask people who are used to working in above the line media to suddenly come up with an earned media idea. Well, you can, because it happens all the time, but it but it never works. X, because they haven't had to think that way, have they? Because they've always gone, well, it's all right because we can just buy the space and X, Y, and Z. But now it just does require that level of thought. Going back to your point around that IKEA Ramadan campaign came from a traditionally above the line agency, but they'd done the work to really understand the subtext.
You just have less control of the story once it's out there, right? It's in the consumer's hands and they'll do with it what they will. Whereas that wasn't the case however long ago. So that presents obviously more
risk and more opportunity, because for so long we would talk about word of mouth, and I was like, how did we get this word of mouth? Because before social media, it's like, well, how do we do that then? And how do we measure it? Now we can. So it's a very exciting time, I think, to be in PR.
Yeah. So we talked about DEI a bit earlier on. I'd like to go into that a little bit. I mean, many brands might treat DEI as a kind of checklist at the end of the production process to avoid getting into trouble, as we've discussed. And Shilpa, what's your advice on moving beyond that mentality, would you say?
We always say, and I feel like a broken record because I do say it all the time on LinkedIn as well, but we always say at Unmistakables, you have to bring that thinking upstream. You can't wait until the ad's been created and then you're worried about casting. You have to really think at the beginning, what is it that we're trying to do here? And I'm talking even as far as looking at product development, which is some of the work that we do at the Unmistakables. We work with brands to be like, okay, if these are the products that you're looking at putting on shelves, how are they going to be interpreted by the media, but also by your consumers and within different cultural contexts? So it's all about bringing that thinking around DEI upstream, having the right voices in the room and knowing what questions to ask. And actually, again, revising the systems and structures that are there when it comes to campaign creation and making sure that you've got checks and balances all the way through. So it doesn't just come to right at the end, someone going, shall we put a black person in an ad?
Good. And so, final question. If a brand does overstep and draw criticism, what's the right way to handle the apology? Is removing the campaign always the right move, would you say? Or is there a way to stand by the work while acknowledging the feedback?
I mean, I think that really depends on what it is, but we've talked already about intentional decisions. So if you've made intentional decisions all the way through and you can stand by them, great. I think we often talk at the Unmistakables about intent versus impact. And a lot of the time we will see brands, when they are apologising, they're referencing their intent. And actually we need to start with the impact. So you talked about the Ant and Dec washing line. That's a great example because, yes, there was an apology made, but the apology was very pithy in my view, because it was like, we apologise if we've offended anyone. Well, obviously you have.
That's the worst, isn't
Obviously you've offended people.
non-apology.
Yeah.
It's a non-apology. It's just nonsense. It's like you have to acknowledge the impact and you have to say what you're going to do differently. And I think whether you pull the work or not is it's case-by-case basis.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I think definitely agree with Shilpa in that it totally depends on the impact that you've caused with the audience. I think sometimes it is the right thing to do to pull the campaign if it's been completely tone deaf or it's been wrong and offended people, and then you can see why as a brand, even if you didn't see it at first. It's interesting, isn't it? Some brands choose not to do that. Back to that Sydney Sweeney Good Jeans example, which once again, I personally really did not like, and clearly I'm not the target consumer. What they did, which was interesting, is they stood back and they just waited and they listened to the noise rather than reacting quickly, which I think a lot of brands do because they're so worried about, I need to stop this flood of hate against the brand. I need to explain what that was in our intent, XYZ. They waited, they ran a lot of research on the side that apparently showed them that most people out there didn't see the eugenics angle, and it was mostly...
I find that amazing that people didn't see the eugenics angle.
I agree, and they've doubled down on it. I just listened to another podcast on it recently, which is why I think it's top of mind for me. Apparently most people didn't see that. Apparently it was mostly industry publications that were coming down hard and, voices on LinkedIn, etc. They were seeing share price rise, they were seeing sales increase, and so they made this decision to do a bit of non-apology, I guess, to use the term we've just used, which was, it was always just about the jeans and only the jeans. I'm paraphrasing. I mean, it wasn't. You used both words. It was never just about jeans. And they stand by that today. They're like, well, look how well the brand is done off the back of it. So even though, that's not an example that I personally get behind, I think brands will probably look at that and think maybe we should pause and wait and use it as an example to say, well, sometimes the criticism is just bots, so it is just the industry. So interesting example, I think.
Yeah, sometimes it's best not to rush in, I suppose. Right, well, I'm conscious that unfortunately we've run out of time. It's been a really interesting conversation, fascinating. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone listening to this has. So thanks so much, Ahalya and Shilpa, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, it's been great.
Pleasure. And thank you, as always, to everyone for listening. Until next time, goodbye.